4 o'clock, but yeah, this is the last talk on at least addressing the chapters. Next week, I'm going to have a talk with Dr. Christopher Nelson, the Dean of Liberal Arts, and we'll be exploring the theme of Christianity. But yeah, this is we're going to start from chapters 28 to the finish of the book here. So we are coming to a conclusion here. So thank you everybody for joining today, and we can go ahead and get started. How would you like to begin, Martha? We're starting on chapter 28. I found chapter 28, Aunt Nancy, quite moving, and yet more revealing about how insidious and dehumanizing slavery was.
Right.
As if we or an explanation of it, but Harriet keeps bringing it.
Right. And I think for me, seeing how this is just the only example that I've seen of how miscarriages, right, and just the birth, right, and even today, African American women, when you see stillbirths and things like that, that they rank higher, I think, even than Mexican American, than Hispanic women in childbirth.
Right here in South Texas, yeah.
Right. And how she had, because of the labor, right, that not the labor, but the work that she would have to do for the white Mrs. Dr. Norcom's wife, how she suffered with her own maternity, right? No such thing as maternity leave. And how many, she had several miscarriages, and
5.
yeah. So
I have in my notes
stood
they
out.
slowly murdered her.
Yeah, and how, go ahead.
Oh, I was just yeah, before we go into her story, I think we should put pause on this because especially for men, unfortunately, unless you have had a wife that's had a miscarriage, it's really easy to go, oh, I guess your pregnancy wasn't successful, I'm sorry, and not really understand how devastating this could be to an expecting mother and to a family. And to have this happen 5 times is a terrible situation and really undermines. Sorry, I interrupted you, but I wanted to highlight that this is, and I'm sure it's obvious to any woman or any mother who has been through pregnancy, but it can be easily kind of overlooked by us men as an unfortunate thing, but yeah, it happens.
So she was robbed of being a mom, is basically what she, Harriet Jacobs and she was her mother's twin sister, right? Harriet Jacobs' mom's twin sister. So that's especially, seeing her twin sister's children, right? Yet she was denied that. That must have been difficult for her. But yeah, whereas Linda's grandmother is like, go back and let them make an example of you, and like, slavery is better. She fears the consequences. Aunt Nancy is like, don't look back, just keep going. Like, if I knew you would be free, that would make me so happy. So slavery, I guess, had like crushed her so much that anything is better than being a slave.
And of course, the Flints are completely oblivious to what they did to Aunt Nancy. They have some sentiment of how they truly did care about her, but it was a utility of caring, right? She was a faithful servant at great expense to her potential children, and ultimately to her life. They basically, slowly murdered her over many years.
And it's
no, go on, please.
Also, like, although she was needed, her life kind of like, I won't say it was expendable, but it's almost like they have a new job posting. Like, Linda could fill her spot, right? Like, bring back Harriet, Harriet Jacobs, Linda, whatever. Bring her back and we'll just replace her, right? And she can take Aunt Nancy's place. So to me, it's almost like, oh, job posting. We need someone else that will we can enslave, that will take Aunt Nancy's spot, and we can use and abuse also.
Yeah. And, we see just how oblivious Mrs. Flint is on page 123. I was long used to sleep with her lying near me on the entry floor. I mean, they literally had her sleeping outside their bedroom floor on the floor.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, yeah. Well, I mean,
Callous.
it's
It's
part of the
callous.
dehumanization process. They don't see these
Mm-hmm.
people as people, and they are so caught up in ego that it's almost comical at this point. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's every chapter, you're just like, these people are, I mean, all slave owners are terrible, but it's like an extra
Mm-hmm.
terrifying element to this. And then
So,
the chapter is talking about her burial, which is interesting.
mm-hmm.
She gets buried with her family, with a little bit of struggle with the Flints. They want her buried with their family, which they're thinking is, hey, we're so caring. We want her.
Mm-hmm.
And it was nice to see that they figured out that no, she needed to be buried with her family.
Right. And that's on page 123 at the end. It was talked of by the slaves as a mighty grand funeral. Northern travelers passing through the place might have described this tribute of respect to the humble dead as a beautiful feature in the patriarchal institution, right? So the appearances again, right? A touching proof of the attachment between slaveholders and their servants, and tender-hearted Mrs. Flint would have confirmed this impression with handkerchief at her eyes. We could have told them a different story. We could have given them a chapter of wrongs and sufferings that would have touched their hearts if they had any hearts. So she takes her dig right there, to feel for the colored people. We could have told them how the poor old slave mother had toiled year after year to earn $800 to buy her son Philip's right to his own earnings, and how that same Philip paid the expenses of the funeral, which they regarded as doing so much credit to the master. So and she also says, like, when it came time for the slave to pay for anything, they were more than willing to let that happen, right? They weren't above being insulted that way, that, oh, you want to pay for this, even better, right? Which to them, I feel like, to the African American, to the slaves, to that family, it would have been a sacrifice, but an endearing and like loved a sacrifice for them to do that, right? To, as I guess, one last gesture of their love for Aunt Nancy.
And definitely she was endeared by the community. I mean, she had quite a few people show up to her funeral, whites and
Mm-hmm.
black people as well. Just so
Mm-hmm.
she was a deeply respected person, who departed way too early. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, she didn't get to see what she wished for Harriet to see her freedom, which is
Right.
about to happen. So,
Mm-hmm.
and so yeah, there's some good news about to happen in this story, although it's always threaded with a little bit of bitterness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, so on chapter 29, Prep for Escape,
Mm-hmm.
um, we get introduced to a character named Fanny, and also the Nightmare of New Year's Day,
Mm-hmm.
where this woman's Fanny, her children are sold,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and Fanny is going to have to escape, not only without her children, like Harriet is going to have to, but at least Harriet, in which Fanny later will make mention of this and sort of not put Harriet in her place, but Harriet makes a mention of, oh, we both know each other's sorrows, and Fanny kind of graciously says, at least you
Mm-hmm.
know where your children are, and you're probably going to see them again. I will never see my children again.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and just how that doesn't, I mean, this does speak to the dignity of these people. How this, I just couldn't imagine my son just I have no idea where he's at, and I know it's not a good place, and I'll never see him again. How
Yeah.
one could just be sane at that point. I think
Mm-hmm.
I would just be crippled with rage
Mm-hmm.
under these circumstances, to where I would just be just a madman.
Yeah. And I think of like after the Civil War that the Freedmen's Bureau reconnected slaves, but this is for the slaves that were alive during this time. But countless generations, were never reunited. They never knew of their loved ones, of their whereabouts. And that was just how things were. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah.
Yeah. So we get to see some more of this, just how dedicated grandmother is.
Mm-hmm.
Offers to sell her home in an effort to help out Harriet as well, which is, I mean, she owes so much to her grandmother throughout this story.
Right.
And she ends up giving, her grandmother is going to give her some money, which is going
Mm-hmm.
to help her quite a bit when she ends up getting up north.
And she helps Fanny too, to buy, I think, was it clothes or something when they get to is it to Boston that they get first, or
I believe
Philadelphia?
so.
I don't remember.
I believe Boston, and then she ends up going to New York, Fanny, in the
Mm-hmm.
end.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but we also see, uh, yeah, I think, oh no, that's in chapter 30. We'll get to that in a little bit. But yeah, anything else from chapter 30?
Um, well, when she was it when she went made arrangements in chapter 29, when her son says, I knew you were here, that was very like, whoa, and
Yes.
like these children had to grow up fast. They didn't have this like ignorant, like not ignorant, but innocent childhood. He understands my mom is hiding, and now I
Mhm.
have this pressed upon me, and I have to steer people away from there and worry, and just how they didn't break under that anxiety. Think of, now we talk about, like, when I was a high school teacher, we would have mental health Monday, right? And they tell me about their weekend, and it was just, this or that, or, but like what this would have done to his mental health, and such a young boy, to know that he has to keep that secret, that was very interesting, because he heard the mom, right? He heard the mom cough, and it's like, oh my goodness. And
Yeah.
and yet didn't tell anyone.
Yeah, he knew the whole time, basically. She was
Mm-hmm.
hiding up in the garret of the shed.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, was able to keep it a secret as a young boy. Yeah, and in later chapters, I mean, this boy grows up real fast. He ends up working on a whaling ship.
Right.
He
Mm-hmm.
can't be more than 12, 13 years old when he's doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's insane. The type,
Yeah.
how fast kids are growing up under these conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, we just see some um, chapter 29, though. What I found interesting is the captain of the ship, so Philip is brokers her escape, basically says that it's now or never. She's almost caught by Jenny, the slave
Mm-hmm.
that's partial to the
Duplicitous.
enslavers,
Uh-huh.
unfortunately.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And so it looked like she was basically looking right at her, and Harriet ducked really quick behind like this barrel, and they're
Mm-hmm.
not too sure, did she see her or not? And
Mm-hmm.
basically, grandmother at first was like, "No, you shouldn't go," and after that, like, "Get out of here! You need to go
Yeah.
now." Um, and then she encounters this very kind captain um, who was a slave trader, but had just grown tired of this, just seeing the brutality of it, and just was like, "Yeah, I'll
Mm-hmm.
help you." And at first, Philip is first it's brokered for Fanny, and so they're just going to take one woman, and then he approaches her and he's like, "You got to take another person." He's like, "What are you talking about? Are you trying to set me up? What's going on
Mm-hmm.
here?" He's like, "No, no, it's Linda." And I guess Fanny was going by Linda as well, and so this captain
Yeah.
was like, "You guys are trying to get me in trouble here, or you're setting me
Mm-hmm.
up." And um, Philip basically says, no way, no, or Peter, I'm sorry, basically says, no, this woman needs help. And it basically explains her situation, and they are stowed in the ship. And he's just very kind. He basically says, you guys can be at the deck, but stay down below. I'll keep an eye out for you. Yeah, you guys can trust me. I'm here to get you guys to safety.
Right. And so that's in chapter 29, right? Or that's already
this is
in
chapter 30. I'm
30.
sorry, I'm probably
Yeah.
jumping ahead here.
So at the end, that she says, be it said, that's I'm looking at page 133, that she's just not gonna trust anyone. And then he kind of takes it, the white son, I mean the captain, he takes it kind of like offense, like, what do you mean, like, you don't trust me? And she's like, no, like, and then on page 133 where it says he saw that I was suspicious, and he said he was sorry now that he had brought us to the end of our voyage, to find I had so little confidence in him. Right, because she's just saying, I don't trust you. If he had ever been a slave, he would have known how difficult it was to trust a white man, right? So that's just like, it's in their DNA, basically. He assured us that we might sleep through the night without fear, that he would take care we were not left unprotected. Be it said to the honor of this captain, Southerner as he was, that if Fanny and I had been white ladies and our passage lawfully engaged, she could not have treated us more respectfully. My intelligent friend Peter had rightly estimated the character of the man whose honor he had entrusted us. It to me, I always, when I teach, it's like, you cannot paint someone just with a broad brush and say all people are this, because there are exceptions. I generally say that when we talk about W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, right? That they were both African American leaders, but they had different approaches. And in this case, Linda is learning that, I think, that, he is a white Southerner and he's a captain, but that, I think that's like her first introduction to that there are differences between people, white Southerners, that some are going to help, but that would very much be the exception and not the rule. So I think she was right to not trust.
Of course.
Yeah.
But it does point to basically the basic problem, not from Harriet's perspective. She has every right not to trust anyone who's white. But it points to the problem of essentialism, right? And she's complicit in this right now, that there's a white man, I don't trust him because he's white. But it's based on her experience. But so too would that be of an enslaver, of black people are this way because they're lazy, they're ignorant, with the enslaver not understanding that that was a form of resistance. Of course they're acting lazy, because why wouldn't they? And of course they're acting ignorant because there's just no incentive for them to do otherwise. But it does create the sense of essentialism, that you can rob an entire group of people of individualism, which is the basis of what it means to be an American, by the way. But just, this is the way they are, and act accordingly. And it just perpetuates this whole system to this very second.
Right.
So yeah, anything else from chapter 29 before we get to?
I think that's all I can see. She talks about the snaky swamp, the swamp, and that, there's snakes and white Southerners, and they're both snakes, the real snake and the other snake. So that was interesting.
Which she was very much acquainted with, that swampy snake. She hid there and she almost died there from the venom of whatever she was bitten by. Yeah, and she's just, yeah, but it was well known that that's where slaves hid out. And really, there's an old blues song, Wade in the Water. It's almost a spiritual. I always would think of that, was that some sort of baptism thing? until I realized that no, wade in the water, get below the water so the bloodhounds don't detect you. Right? It's an old slave narrative that was put to song.
Oh, wow.
But we get to, she ends up in Philadelphia. So this is where she's first lands. She's going to be in Philadelphia, where she meets Reverend Jeremy Durham, who is a very kind gentleman, a very sensitive gentleman. He basically inquires to her situation, and he's going out of his way saying, I'm not trying to pry, but what's your story? And she's very reluctant to tell her story just because of the illegitimacy of her children as she sees it. But he basically says, thank you for telling me this. You've got nothing to be ashamed of, but be careful who you tell the story to, because people will view you with contempt. And
that stings.
This is heartbreaking. The word contempt, this is on page 135. The word contempt burned me like coals of fire. I replied, God only knows how I have suffered, and he, I trust, will forgive me. And again, that's really heartbreaking. She's got nothing to be ashamed of at all. If I permitted to have my children, I intend to be a good mother and to live in such a manner that people cannot treat me with contempt. Right. So not only love. Go on.
She had not been given the, like, it's almost like she had not been given the opportunity, like, you can be a virtuous woman, or you can, be a non-virtuous and be treated contemptuously. She had not been given the choice. She was a slave, right? So she couldn't be judged the same way as people up in the north, so yeah, that's why. And Sean, I wanted to go back a little bit.
Sure.
Remember when we've talked about how in past talks I've talked about how she had agency. Harriet Jacobs had a measure, like a modicum of agency. And when the grandmother tells her that her kids are going to be sent, where were they going to be sent? It's that the grandmother says, what are you going to do? Do you remember that part?
No,
it's in some other okay, so it's on it's in, what is this, 28, the new destination for the children on page 115.
Okay.
That they're going to send, it just says new destination for the children, so they're going to send the daughter to Mr. Sands. So Benny did not hear the answer, but he came home very indignant with a strange lady because he had called him a Negro. A few days afterwards, Mr. Sands called on my grandmother and told her he wanted to take the children to his house. He said he had informed his wife of his relation to them and told her they were motherless and she wanted to see them. And so when he had gone, my grandmother came and asked what I would do. The question seemed a mockery. What could I do? They were Mr. Sland's slaves, and their mother was a slave whom he had represented to be dead. So as much as I have said in the past that she did have agency, that she did not choose, you remember when I said that Dr. Flint had said there's A and B, and she chose C, but there were other occasions where her status as a slave is very present, right? When they say, what are you going to do? And you can, I mean, obviously we can never feel like her, but have you ever been in that situation where when somebody says, well, what are you going to do about it? And you realize you can't do anything about it. And that's just this like upsetting feeling of being powerless, right? And so that to me, that was a very good example of that she is a slave, and she has, that, because she says that the question was a mockery, like, well, what are you going to do? And I don't think the grandmother felt, was mocking her, but it was like, to her, she says it was a mockery.
Yeah. And again, this is dealing with her children, which is, I I can't put myself in the situation. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, even when her children are somewhat safe up north, or at least her daughter is for a good deal of time with a very questionable family.
Mm-hmm.
But at least she's not the child isn't well, sort of enslaved, but I just can't, yeah, I can't put myself in that situation and think that I would be able to live in dignity. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's just another example of how much I admire this person, um,
Right.
of just how she just kept her eye on the ball, right? She was always
Right.
thinking, you probably wanted to just freak out, but you
Mm-hmm.
know, there's something greater to live for, make sure my children are safe. And so she has to bite her tongue. She has to,
Yeah, and she does that continually, and even as a um when she reaches the north and she is um what would you call it? I wouldn't say that she's free. What because she wasn't free, but that she's living in the free states.
yeah,
And
she come to say I'm not free here when she
yeah,
realizes how much prejudice and
yeah.
racism involved there
And
too.
she realizes that there are things that that she has to abide, humiliation, discrimination, segregation when they separate her, like you cannot be here. And she, like you said, that she's thinking, like, keeping her eye on the ball, like, I cannot, this is not, how they say, if you're going to choose that hill to die on, and she'll be like, this is not the hill I'm going to die on, so I'm
Yeah.
going to have to accept this humiliation for now. And there are I have other priorities.
Yeah.
So
So yeah, back to chapter 31, just basically when she's done talking with Reverend Jeremiah Durham, um, he basically says to her, I respect your sentiments. This is after she says that, I plan to, I am permitted to have my children. I intend to be a good mother and live in such a good manner that people cannot treat me with contempt, right? And he says,
mm-hmm,
I respect your sentiments. Place your trust in God and be governed by good principles, and you will not fail to find friends, which I thought was some good foreshadowing here, because this is really what saves her, is she is governed
mm-hmm,
by these really good principles. She understands her
mm-hmm,
limits. She understands when she does have agency and she acts on it
mm-hmm,
precisely. But yeah, she understands it's narrow. It's a very narrow thing. But because she does act on good principles, she's always, it's not a coincidence that she is always met with, especially in the North, with people that mean her well and are
mm-hmm.
trying to help her um, going forward. One thing I found interesting too is she makes mention of the noise of the city that confused her. And this, I think it could be easily kind of passed off of, oh, she's from the South, she's not used to a big city. But what I saw in this, and this is what I really appreciate about this book, it's a microcosm of greater trends and structures that are going on that we
Mm-hmm.
typically read about in textbooks. This is the experience of millions of Americans just going to the city for the first time and hearing the
Mm-hmm.
trains and the bustle of the factories and the people and the streetcars of it's wild. I mean, to us in the modern age,
Mm-hmm.
of course, cities make noise. But to somebody who's, and this would be true, most people are living in rural agricultural areas, to go to a city like Philadelphia would be dizzying. It would just be like,
Yeah,
what is this? This is out of
yeah.
this world. So I
In
thought that,
2019, I went to Chicago. And the noise of Chicago is not the noise of the valley, right? You hear sirens and this and that, and at all the time. And even like sometimes when you're watching the news and they're interviewing someone and they're in New York, you'll start to hear sirens all of a sudden, and it's like, wait, what's going on? And that's just part of their daily. Oh, because the fire also, right? That's an excellent example
yeah.
of in the South, everybody gets up, especially the slaves, right, to go help with the fire. And she hears the fire. Is it Philadelphia, right? And she's like,
Mhm.
"Get up, we gotta go." And they're like, "No, go back to bed." So
Country
that's
girls, what are you
an
doing? Yeah,
that's an
which
example.
which I think is she's being introduced to a world of commerce, right? Where there's a place for people to do that. People get paid to do that here, right? A lot of these people are probably volunteers back in this day, but you know, that's very true. It's something that we're accustomed to. You know, fire truck go right in front of your house, and you're just like, you might close the blinds because it's too noisy, right? You're just like, oh,
Yeah.
I hope our neighbors are okay, right?
Uh-huh.
Uh,
But you know
but
they're gonna be involved in putting it out.
yeah, you'd be in the way, right? But yeah, this is quite interesting, her experience in Philadelphia. Um, the railroad itself, right? This is where she's beginning to realize that racism exists. She's put in the boxcar, the Jim Crow car, which is a
Right.
character from the minstrel shows that basically becomes a placard for all Black people. Later will become the uh, the label for the segregation laws. But
Yeah.
it was a terrible experience for her. You know, it was and the people there, they're drinking whiskey, they're smoking, coarse jokes, right? It was just an awful experience where she's beginning to realize that things aren't as well as she thought that they would be in the so-called free states.
I had that mark too for the Jim Crow because we hear a lot of it, like you said, after the Jim Crow laws that will but John, these are in the North. These Jim Crow cars are in the North. So she's learning that there might not be the institution of slavery is not in the North like it is in the South, but the prejudice, the segregation is there, right? And so that was very interesting to me that she is learning that they're not treated as equals, which to her she's always been an equal. You know, she has said that in the past, right? I'm equal to you. I'm nothing less. um so yeah, interesting.
Yeah. The next chapter, chapter 32, the meeting of mother and daughter, where she is going to be reunited with Ellen for the first time in many years. And so this is a very beautiful passage in this book, where we get to see that she's being reunited with Ellen. See, um, where's the shoot? I lost my place here. Where she does notice that Ellen is not being cared for. You see that she's not being well fed. She's not able to read. And this was something that she was promised. And this gives her further frustration with Mr. Sands, who not only hasn't emancipated them, but has put them with this family that later we find out they're alcoholics. And the same thing is going to happen to Ellen that happened to her. Like she points out that foul words were being basically said to her. And she doesn't go into detail what that is, but we can imagine this drunk man saying this to this girl that the same age as Harriet was when Dr. Flint started sex pesting her, harassing her. So we see that with her again, and just adding to this frustration of, and just, yeah, again, I can't put myself in the situation of just knowing, one, I can't raise my son, my child on my own, but also knowing that my child is not in good hands.
Right. And also because so she knows that because while she remains a slave, so do her children, because they follow the condition of the mother. So she thinks like, I need to be free. So she'll write to Dr. Flint again, saying, you know, maybe now, you know, he'll be ready to sell me. Even though she did not agree with buying herself. Um, so she wrote also to her. So it's just tragic, right? That she's looking for a way out of this mess.
Yes, indeed. um, yeah, and then she's later going to be reunited. She's wondering in this chapter, she's wondering about her brother William. which she later will be reunited with. But yeah, it's this ongoing urge to be reunited with everybody. So yeah, she's caught in this situation. And so she's just more determined than ever to find employment, so she could save some money, so she could either one, raise her children and or purchase them somehow, some way, right? With this unbridling faith of it's going to happen.
Yeah, and then how to go on the job hunt because she has no recommendations, right? And she says that her what was it? Her hiding had left her not with the best physical strength, best health conditions. So I think she was very fortunate to find someone that was considerate, because they said that she would, if walking too much would cause her limbs to swell, I believe. And so her mistress, or her employer was kind enough to say, well, let's try this, let's change that. So she was very fortunate in that the employer was willing to work with her.
Yeah, and she has to, complicating this is she can't really tell about her past because she's a fugitive, right? Although the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 hasn't been passed, it's part of the Constitution that if you know of a person who's escaped slave, you're legally obligated to turn that person in under penalty of law, right? And that law is going to get more teeth after 1850, but that's still the case, though, where she has to keep it quiet, and
she's not going to trust anyone.
And in some points, she does have to trust people, right? She tells her employer later that Mrs. Bruce that of the situation, and Mrs. Bruce doesn't mean her any ill will and thanks her for telling of her situation, but it is something that that plagues her, that she has to keep this quiet. Yeah. So we get to chapter 33. So she is seeking employment. She's going to find employment with Mrs. Bruce to take care of Mrs. Bruce's daughter, Mary, which she grows to love very much, and she's a very good caregiver to Mary throughout the rest of this book. And then she is reunited with William, her brother, and this is a very tender moment. He's basically dressed as a sailor, and so she kind of just picks him out of a crowd, like, is that him? And so she finds him, and they basically he stayed in New York a week. His old feelings, so she's now in New York. His affections for me and Ellen were livelier than ever. So he's there with his niece, Harriet's daughter. And then she mentions there are no stronger bonds than those which are formed by suffering together, right? And this is what's really bound her and her brother together forever,
right?
As they were raised under these conditions, right? And then we get to, is there anything else from that chapter you'd like to touch on?
No, just when you talked about William, he was the one that said, I just had resolved that I wasn't going to be a slave. So, that he left
right from the get-go.
Mr. Sands, right? And no regrets, and
even though he was kind to him.
yeah. So they both had that strong, this isn't right. But I think it's because, like I said, they didn't realize they were slaves from the very beginning. They were introduced.
They didn't realize they were slaves until she was 6, which is really astounding. And incidentally, there is a book. He wrote a book. Her brother wrote a book as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's out of print. You can get copies of it for at least $80. But yeah, if it was a little bit more accessible, it would be fascinating to read that, to see if it was just a captivating story. Okay. And then, yeah, so the next chapter, the old enemy again, where I believe, yeah, it's so pathetic, Dr. Sands. He writes this fake letter from supposedly Mrs. Flint's brother, who's too young to write a letter like this. So it's such a stupid letter, but it's just over the top, just obvious that this is a fake letter because it's, your letter to the sister was received a few days ago. I gather that you are desirous of returning to your native place among your friends and relatives. We are all gratified with the contents of your letter, right? And it goes on and on and on, just about how much we love you and how much we want you back. And she basically, points out that this guy is resting on the fact that he thinks Black people are stupid, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, it kind of points to the weakness of white supremacy, that if you view all people as stupid, well, you're bound to get bit. And so she's basically getting all this information about what they know about her. And, obviously she's not going to fall for this, but it's just another example of just how much contempt the Flints have for her. And they mean her no goodwill whatsoever, despite the lies. We got
we have a question.
Yeah, didn't Jacobs pass through and stay in Rochester, New York, right around the same time as some of the acknowledged rock stars in the chapter of History 30? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
And Doctor, I mean, she's almost like a Forrest Gump character. She's running into all of these major historical players, like Reverend Durham is, a major player in the abolitionist movement. And yeah,
Amy Post, I think Frederick Douglass too. But Rochester was on the Erie Canal, was a stop on the Erie Canal. And so that was like a happening place where ideas, I think Seneca Falls was close to the Erie Canal too. So that's like the hub of like a meeting place there too for abolitionists, women's rights suffrage, things like that.
Yeah, it was where all these liberals lived. Yeah, and so we get to the next chapter, unless there's something else you'd like to talk about in this chapter.
I think that was it.
Next chapter, Prejudice Against Color, where she's again getting acquainted with just how racist the North is. And just as a side note, a lot of what motivated people to join the Union Army, besides those that were conscripted or drafted, is that they had contempt for Southern slaves because you guys have produced all of these Black people. Like South Carolina, they were outnumbered 2-1. And it's like, you have these inferior people in the midst of us. And what are we supposed to do once slavery ends, right? And so you backward Southerners. And so it's, that's something that I think sometimes surprises students, that Northerners were just as racist as Southerners,
especially
absence of slavery.
I'm reading a book on the crisis of the 1830s, the economic crisis, and how like the Anglos, like the white Protestants, hated the Irish Catholics that were immigrating, but yet they would come together to discriminate and beat African Americans, right? So they would put their own prejudice aside to unite against African Americans, beating them, causing riots, burning down their places, their churches. So yeah, that racism and prejudice is very prevalent and virulent in the North at this time too.
Yeah, and the Irish were in a pretty delicate situation as new immigrants to this country. They're Catholic. We view Irish people today as white, but they're not viewed as white at all.
Yeah, I have a book that I'm gonna.
So a lot, especially after the Civil War, the Irish are virulent racists. And a lot of it had to do with basic job competition, right? And so an employer could have these people outbid each other. The Irish would work for cheaper, or the Black people would work cheaper, and this would cause tension between these communities.
Right. Are you familiar with this book?
Oh yeah, yeah. That's
How
a
the
great
Irish became white,
Mhm.
and it talks about that, right? That they were not viewed as white, and they fought for their whiteness. But yeah, so this is the time, right?
Congratulations, Irish people.
Yeah, there's a when I was in grad school, we read was it the Great Arizona Abduction, that there's so many Irish orphans in New York City. And because no one wants them because they're Catholic, they send them to Catholic families in, I think, Arizona. But when those Irish get to Arizona, the white people say, no, these kids are white and they can't go with the Mexicans. And so they go and they literally abduct them from the Mexican families because they don't want the Mexicans to have those white children. So it's that fluidity of race, I guess, at the time.
Yeah,
But now
incidentally,
we're
too,
off.
we were just reading from Howard Zinn's We Take Nothing But Conquest, which is all about the Mexican-American War. And in that chapter, it's talked about how the Irish deserted and joined the Mexican army because they didn't view themselves as white. You know, they didn't even have that concept, and then they were treated so poorly. But what they saw in the Mexicans is that we're fellow Catholics. I'm not going to fight and try to kill Catholics.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Interesting.
Just jumping ahead, we're getting a little short on time here,
Okay.
but we get, we get to learn that Ellen, in the chapter, the confession, where Harriet once again is feeling this unnecessary shame, but it does make sense in the context of her time. She wants to be this virtuous woman, but it wasn't in her cards. But yeah, Ellen is just like, Mom, you don't need to tell me about this. I know everything, right? I know Mr. Sands is my father. The guy doesn't care about me. All of my love is for you. And so,
No,
yeah,
that was
I know the
heartbreaking.
sacrifices you made. And so please don't worry at all about anything from your past. You didn't do anything wrong, which I felt very, that was a
Yeah,
very
that was very
heartfelt
moving.
moment. Moving on to just a quick observation about a visit to England in that chapter, where if there is prejudice in England, she didn't detect it. I'm sure there was, but it was minuscule to what she was experiencing, both in the South and the North.
Right. And by this time, am I frozen or are you frozen, Sean? Who's frozen? It's him. Okay. So then you all can hear me. Okay, so by this time, England has already abolished slavery. So, because it was in the 1830s, and this is already going on to the 1850s. So that has happened. Are you there, Sean? You're muted.
Okay, I lost connection real quick. Let me make sure I'm still recording.
It says it is.
Okay, excellent. All right. Yeah. So what were you saying? Something?
Oh, that by this time, when she went to England, by this time, England had already abolished slavery, right, in the 1830s. And this is probably 1840s, maybe 1850s, because it's getting close to the the fugitive slave law.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of reminds, it's completely different context, and I'm kind of stretching this, but an old Richard Pryor bit where when he went to Africa for the first time, and he said, for the first time in my life, I didn't see any N-words. And then he pledged never to use that word again. And so, completely different context. I don't mean to stretch that, but it did make me think of that, where here Harriet is, where the color of her skin is not an issue whatsoever. And she's noticing things like, yeah, even though these people are poor that she's acquainted with, and they have their own problems, they seem happier. They have more resources than they do in America. They're eating well to the extent that they can. Their clothes are of a better quality, and they just seem happier there. And so it was just very interesting to see her experience in England for 10 months there.
Right.
But yeah, for purposes of time, maybe we should just jump to the fugitive slave law, because this is where these large historical trends are intersecting with her life. And this cannot be emphasized of how much of a game changer this is, because this really puts a target on her back. Not only does it give the Flints more of an impetus to find her, but just what this law, it created economic incentives for bounty hunters to go up and hunt people and to return them to the South, even though some of these people were born free. But yeah, it is a terrible situation for everybody in the South. I'm going to put in the notes here a video that I would very much recommend. It's just a clip from the documentary Making of America Slavery. And it talks about a guy named Aaron Burns from Boston, who was an escaped slave and was a pillar of the community. He was employed. He was a business partner for several people. He was a person of faith, so he was involved in church. And this was a moment where people in the North, especially in Boston, which has always been a firebrand for people there, to where real contempt for the South, because this was a friend to a lot of people. And it was crazy. Basically, a deputy gets killed, and the president at that time sends in the Marines. 1,000 Marines are there to capture this guy. So it costs a tremendous amount of money just to get this one guy. And for the people living in Boston, it's like, you Southerners. And it really makes them feel disempowered. I mean, you basically are determined, we are not going to let this guy go. There's coffins outside of windowsills. People are putting black drapes in their windows. But it really just makes them feel completely disempowered. Like, you took somebody we cared about just so you can live your despicable lifestyle of slavery. And yeah, when the time comes, we will pick up our guns and gladly kill us some Southerners.
Right. So again, my little soapbox that I get on when I hear, like, when they talk about Thomas Jefferson and that he was a slaveholder, and they're like, oh, well, he was a man of his time. And to me, that's like, no, he was a man of his culture, not of his time, because there were Quakers that wanted to abolish slavery. When the Constitution was ratified, that was just my essay question for my students. Is like, why did they allow slavery? And to me, what I have, maybe you can tell me that I'm wrong, Sean, but it was, the Constitution established a national government. It did not establish like a non-slave country, right? The purpose was to establish a unified country, that to fix the Articles of Confederation, right? It's just a stronger national government. But you have people like the Bruce, like the new Mrs. The two, what was it Bruce? Both of them were the new Mrs. Bruce, right? Her mistresses, they're her employers.
Yeah, the original Mrs. Bruce dies, and then he quickly remarries.
Yeah. That they were in favor of equality, not just ending slavery, but equality for African Americans. So that's, even in that time, right? They wanted to be for some, not for some, but for African Americans to be treated equally. So I just thought of when you were talking about the people in Boston, that they're very upset, and abolitionists, right? Like you said.
Yeah, speaking of Thomas Jefferson, that guy was the epitome of ambivalence, right? He knew it was wrong, and he knew it would destroy this country. But he was born into it, right? It's sort of like, what am I going to do? Just give up all my wealth and privilege? No, but he was, he foolishly thought that the Louisiana Territory would be an end to slavery and bring forth his vision of the yeoman farmer, of independent white settlers. Slavery would slowly diminish, right? Just foolish thinking on his part, but he understood it was wrong right from the get-go. I mean, he was definitely a sensitive individual and was capable of self-reflection. But yeah, he was a man of culture. He was also a virulent white supremacist. His notes on Virginia are disgusting. If anyone gets a chance to read them, you'll get a sense of just what a white supremacist this guy was. But
Mhm.
I get the sense he wrote that because he was getting dope slapped by his colleagues for going, all men are created equal, right? He's like, oh, not all men.
Yeah,
Let
yeah,
me
yeah.
qualify that a little bit.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, so this is a fascinating chapter. She brings up an old acquaintance of hers. What was that individual's name?
Oh, that
Ooh,
was beaten.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
senselessly. Almost, I mean, almost for fun, it looked like. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, this guy was a very determined guy, basically. You know, he when she's talking with him and basically said, I told him of the fugitive slave law, and asked him if he did not know that New York was a city of kidnappers, right? And this is talking about
Mm-hmm.
basically not only the enslavers coming, but the bounty hunters. And he replied, "Did risk ain't so bad for me. It is thus for you, because I runned away from the speculator, and you runned away from the massa. Them
Mm-hmm.
speculators want spend their money to come here for a runaway if they ain't certain sure to put them in harm's way on him. And I tell you that I took a good care about that. I had to hard times down there to let them catch this N word, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this very determined guy who ends up fleeing up to Canada, and she never sees him
Mm-hmm.
again. But it's
Mm-hmm.
an example of just how perilous it was for all people involved. And families are going to get split up, right? She mentions just how, you know, husbands are finding out that their wives were runaways, wives are finding out the same thing, and like, what do we
Mm-hmm.
do? And then it's
Mm-hmm.
double jeopardy for mothers because again, the servitude follows the condition of the mother, so these
Mm-hmm.
children are in peril as well. So it's just a
Mm-hmm.
horrible, horrible situation all around. Um, but yeah, in the last few minutes, we get to the last chapter, free at last, right? These great
Mm-hmm.
words preceding what Dr. King would later say about 100 years later, free at last, God Almighty, free
Mm-hmm.
at last. But, you know, it's not, this is a little bit bitter though. Like, you know, her pride is a little bit hurt when she's finally
Mm-hmm.
freed. Um, Emily Flint is a grown woman now, and she's making overtures to try to trick Harriet in vain. Harriet's obviously not even tempted to fall for this, but like, come
Mm-hmm.
home, we love you, we care about you, come home. And so this Mr. Dodge, she's now Mrs. Dodge. Mr. Dodge is trying to get her to come back as well. And finally, it's brokered to where they're able to purchase them from the Flints once and forever. But she's a little ambivalent about this. It's like, I don't want to be
Mm-hmm.
purchased, right? Just give me my freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Especially I don't want any money going to that disgusting family. But to her benefit, though, uh, she is sold, as disgusting as it sounds, for a bargain in many ways for
Mm-hmm.
$300, which they could have gotten a
Mm-hmm.
lot more money of that. And basically, the
Right.
reason why she was sold so cheap is like they basically had leverage over the Dodges and basically
Mm-hmm.
said that, hey, if you don't take this money, we know people that will hide her forever. And so take the
Mm-hmm.
money. And so he's like, well, okay, $300 is $300. And so she is free. And
Yeah.
then also a condition of that sale is her children will be free forever as well. So in the
Right.
end, we're seeing something of value here for her.
Um, yeah, and she writes that she loves freedom, but that she hates to look at the piece of paper that purchased it because she's still like, but I despise the miscreant who demanded payment for what never rightfully belonged to him or his, right? So she just like, my freedom is my freedom. But the last thing I wanted to mention was when Uncle Philip died, that they put an obituary. Uh, so that's on page 166. Time passed on, and paper came to me from the South containing an obituary notice of my Uncle Philip. It was the only case I ever knew of such an honor conferred upon a colored person, right? That just the simple decency of having an obituary. Um,
Mm.
and then she says, it was written by one of his friends and contained these words: now that death has laid him low, they call him a good man and a useful citizen. But what eulogies to the black man when the world has faded from his vision. It does not require man's praise to obtain a rest in God's kingdom. So, but then so they called a color man a citizen, strange words to be uttered in that region, because it was the 14th Amendment that made them citizens after the Civil War. So they were not considered citizens, but this person is calling him a citizen. So to her, that's one of those, hey, that's above and beyond what anyone has ever called a slave or a former slave or an African American, because he was no longer a slave, right? His mom had bought him his freedom, but yet he was not considered a citizen because, like I said, it would be the 14th Amendment that would confer that on African Americans.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, yeah, we get to the end. Yeah, that's a great point that, this strange condition that enslaved people are in, and even free Black people are in. They are not citizens. At best,
Right.
citizens. So we get to the end of this book, basically. Reader, my story ends with freedom, not in the usual way with marriage. I and my children are now free. We are free from the power of slaveholders, and are the white people, and are the white people of the North. And though that, according to my ideas, it's not saying a great deal, it's a vast improvement in my condition. The dream of my life is not yet realized. I do not sit with my children in a home of my own. I still long for a hearthstone of my own, however humble. I wish for my children's sake far more than my own. But God so orders circumstances to keep me with my friend, Mrs. Bruce. Love, duty, gratitude also bind me to her side. It is a privilege to serve her, who pities my oppressed people, and who are bestowed in this inestimable boon of freedom on me and my children. It has been painful to me in many ways to recall the dreary years I passed in bondage. I would gladly forget them if I could. Yet the retrospection is not altogether without solace, for with those gloomy recollections come tender memories of my good old grandmother, like light, fleecing clouds floating over a dark and troubled sea. And that is the end of this book, right? So it's sort of a bittersweet end of a life filled with turmoil, but with love, right? She's remembering her grandmother who has recently died, who would never get to see her free, which is also a bitter end to this as well. So yeah, we do have some time to go through some comments or questions here. Her hope and resilience in the face of oppression isn't, Lenore, yeah, absolutely great insight. It really is incredible. And, there's a lot of talk about how the heroes of American history are under attack, right? And so if you ever feel that way, you have a hero right here. I mean, this is the epitome of the spirit of what it means to be an American. Somebody who's, as you said, Martha, she's never felt unequal. She understood herself to be on equal grounds with anybody she encountered, but really kind of held up to the face of those that were claiming to be Christian, claiming to be Americans. That, well, like, what's going on here? You guys are just a bunch of hypocrites, right? And her dignity really is, I think, something that is worth noting, and really gives us a solid American hero,
Right.
in this country's history. Christopher Nelson, as in her saying, the freedom I had before, money was paid, was dearer to me. God gave me the freedom, but man put God's image in the scales with a paltry sum of $300. I'm still not at all convinced that I can begin to understand what she meant by that. I think the fact that she was saying bought was humiliating. Yeah, I think that's what she's getting at. Also, she makes mention that she doesn't want any money going to these people, right?
Right.
But yeah, it's a bittersweet experience for her that she has this bill of sale, which she mentions that later, people looking at the progress of Western civilization would take note of as evidence of progress. But you know, and it does improve her life. She no longer has to worry about the Fugitive Slave Act anymore for herself and her children.
Mhm.
But yeah.
Yeah, I think when she's talking about like Poles, did you catch that? When she's talking, she says, Poles come here for freedom, and is it Hungarians? But
Mhm.
I am here and an American. Where is that?
Yeah, it's in one of the latter chapters.
Yeah.
But I do
It's I
remember
think
her.
when she's talking about the fugitive slave law.
Mhm.
Where is it? Okay, so when she's talking to, and this is for Dr. Nelson, there I sat in that great city, guiltless of crime, yet not daring to worship God in any of the churches. I heard the bells ringing for afternoon service, and with contemptuous sarcasm, I said, will the preachers take for their text, proclaim liberty to the captive and the opening of prison doors to them that are bound? Or will they preach from the text, do unto others as you would do unto them? Oppressed Poles and Hungarians could find a safe refuge in that city. John Mitchell, which was who was he? An Irish revolutionary who expressed support for American slavery, was free to proclaim in the city hall his desire for a plantation well stocked with slaves. But there I sat, an oppressed American, not daring to show my face. God forgive the black and bitter thoughts I indulged on that Sabbath day. The scripture says, oppression makes even a wise man mad, and I was not wise. So she's just mad,
Yeah.
upset, that she's having to live under that system. But yet she feels very much that God has given her freedom, that the government and others will not. So, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, not to diminish her situation at all, but in many ways, she truly was the free person throughout this book. You can argue
Mm-hmm.
that Dr. Flint and Mrs. Flint were never free. They were caught up in
Right.
ego. They were caught up in their hatred, and it ends up destroying them. I was very glad to see that he basically died poor.
Mm-hmm.
He lost all of his money, and the only assets he had were slaves, and three of the slaves at least were gone. And so this guy, um, clinging on to his role in society as a white man, as the patriarch, right, as this
Mm-hmm.
good Christian, quote unquote, good, died basically impoverished in the end.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, we are at the end, but if there's anybody that has any questions or any last minute comments or insight, please share them. But and while we're waiting for that potential comment or question, I just want to say thank you, Martha, very much
Oh, thank
for
you, Sean.
your devoted time. I know, you know, I get out of class at 1:30 on Tuesdays, and so I'm able to stretch out and relax a little bit, have some food, and go, where's Martha? Why isn't she on? No, I'm just kidding. So I do
Complain when
thank
I
you.
get.
Yeah, I do thank you. I know your time is pressed, and your insights and comments throughout these last few months have helped me better understand the importance of this book. So I
Oh,
thank
well,
you quite a
thank
bit.
you. Thank you. And just to end on the impoverished, Thomas Jefferson died in debt too. And they
Yeah,
sold
most of
his
the
slaves.
yeah, well, the banks sold his slaves, right?
Yeah.
And that was
Yeah.
very typical, right? So Thomas Jefferson, as this enlightened white guy, said, you know, put in his will to free his slaves, but he had put so much money in Monticello that by the time of his death, he was heavily in
Mm-hmm.
debt. And so to
Mm-hmm.
recoup their losses, the people that he had uh, uh, who had lent him money, the bankers, sold all of the slaves off,
Yeah.
which was horrific for the people that were enslaved under Jefferson.
That was another thing that like Harriet Jacobs writes, like if these people that have Ellen, if they fall into hard times, they'll sell her, and so any slave was bound to be sold for economic reasons. So they understand, like, they're terrible with money, and they'll sell us, when they need it. So there's no security in that too. So another trauma that they faced.
Yeah, so much for the master race, right? These people, these drunks, these people who can't handle money, who take no personal responsibility, and cause just so much misery in just their claim to be
that we're still dealing with today.
Yeah. So, oh yeah, yeah.
Did you put the sign-in sheet? I don't remember.
Oh yeah. The valuable sign-in sheet. Let me grab it real quick. Okay, and
thank you guys.
Here we go. Oops.
Are you ready, Dr. Nelson, for your talk? Is he still here?
Yes, we're going to do that next week. So next Tuesday from 3 to 5, we are going to have a talk on this book. This will be basically the capstone of this book. And we'll be diving into the very prevalent Christian element of this book, right? And looking at Harriet's relationship with Christianity, grandmother's relationship with it, Dr. Flint's relationship with it, right? Just looking at different characters, looking at the themes of Christianity throughout this book, and seeing what, through that lens of what further this book could explain about really what's going on with these characters in the story that is being told here. Oh, you're welcome, Anna. Thank you for joining. I know you've been consistent and joining on with us throughout these talks. So yeah, the sign-in sheet is in the Trevor Noah as promised. I'll check that out.
Oh, I clicked on it. Yeah, I'll see it.
But yeah, let me know if anybody's having trouble getting signed in there. If you are having trouble, just put your information that's being asked in the sign-in sheet right there in the chat. Otherwise, just put it in the chat in the sign-in sheet.
So Dr. Nelson asked, would students like to do something like this again next year for another book?
Yes. I hear we are going to do the Heart of Darkness next year with the Common Reading program. So most definitely, that is a classic book that has a lot of parallels to the Vietnam War. In fact, Apocalypse Now is a book based on the Heart of Darkness, which is all about the Vietnam War. Yeah, I look forward to dusting off my copy that I don't think I have read since I was an undergraduate. So it'll be good to get back into that book once again to share it with students.
That's such a terrible book.
Yeah, Heart of Darkness. It's in many ways this book could be called the Heart of Darkness. Let me repost it in case you missed it, Gabriella. It's right there. So click that link for the sign-in sheet. Let me make sure people are signing in okay.
Oh, your cat just woke up.
Oh, good morning, Storm. Nice of you to join us. Oh, you're gonna go eat? Okay.
So do you want to do these talks for the Heart of Darkness, Sean?
Oh yeah, definitely. So yeah, this will be something that I'll read over the summer and see if any ideas, probably, the same kind of thing, just breaking it up into chapters and going through it. I think this has helped me quite a bit of breaking this up into chapters and to kind of slow down and to see some things in this book that I probably wouldn't have seen otherwise. This has held me accountable throughout the semester of being really in tune with what Harriet wanted to tell us from the past. Yeah. So I thank you, Harriet Jacobs. Your spirit lives on with us.
Yeah, and I also thought about how she, as a writer, right, that she would steal time, to write down hers, which writers today still do, right? Like wake up at 5 a.m. to start writing, or so that's another I guess topic, her writing, and well, there was edited also, but her process,
very little though. Maria Childs made it known that I did very little as her editor. She just rearranged a couple of chapters, she said, to make the story flow a little bit better. But she said, and she knew right from the get-go too. That's very interesting that people were going to doubt
The
a lot
veracity.
of these incidents of this book.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, again, we've mentioned this before, but this book was not assigned to high school students or college students until the 1970s, from the work of Professor Fagan from North Carolina,
Yeah.
who went through the stacks. She read the letters. She verified all of the pseudonyms and was able to identify the actual people that Harriet is writing about. And so this book, yeah, very sad that this book was dismissed out of misogyny, white supremacy, and just a relic of these crazy abolitionists, right? It was thought that Maria Childs created the story out of fiction.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess we can call this a day. So thank you again, Martha. This will
Thank
be great.
you.
Until next semester, yeah, we'll take a look at what we're going to do with the Heart of Darkness. But yeah, next
Okay.
week, next Tuesday, I'll put it all out. But from 3 to 5, Dr. Nelson, myself, will be taking a look at
Yeah.
this book in its entirety. Well, not its entirety, but just looking through the Christian themes of this book.
Okay. Well, I'll log on after my class ends at 3:45, so I'll rush
Okay.
over and like
Yeah, a couple more weeks.
connect and everything else. But
We're almost
well, thank
done.
you very much. You all have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Last chance. Anybody having trouble signing in, just put your information that's being asked in the chat if you're having trouble signing in. Other than that, looks like everybody's got it. So I will see everybody later.